Welcome back to another comparison video. Today we're comparing the 6800 XT against the 3080 Ti in Horizon Forbidden West. And it's quite the battle, I tell you. But first, just a quick channel update. I will be changing the channel name slightly to TerraWare, and I'm also going to create a Twitter account for the channel, essentially. I've never had a Twitter account, so I guess we'll find out if it's a good idea or not. But that's pretty much it as far as channel updates. Let's get on with the video. We're going to start with 1080p, but we're also going to look at 1440, 4K, and then also DLSS and FSR. But I'll explain the settings real quick here. Both GPUs will obviously be using the same exact settings, and we're going to use TAA for anti-aliasing for the native resolutions. And then for the graphics, it's essentially going to be the very high graphical preset, and then we're turning texture filtering to 16 times anisotropic filtering. And then the only other thing that I've disabled is lens flares, vignette, radial blur, and chromatic aberration. Well, let's check out 1080p then. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the way I do my comparisons, is we essentially play the same exact part of the game on both graphics cards, and then at the end of the run, we compare the averages and 1% lows. And at 1080p, that puts the 6800 XT on the lead with 120 FPS on the averages compared to 106 FPS for the 3080 Ti, which equals to 13% faster for the 6800 XT on the averages. And on the 1% lows, the 6800 XT is 24% faster with 87 FPS compared to 3080 Ti's 70 FPS for the 1% lows. And this is all why the 6800 XT is consuming less power. This kind of mirrors the results of my 7900 XTX versus 4090 video, except for in that video the 7900 XTX was consuming 50% more power than the 4090. I had both cards manually overclocked in that comparison, and it's the same thing here. You can see the 6800 XT is running at almost 2.7 gigahertz with the 3080 Ti almost at 2.1 gigahertz. So both cards are overclocked. Now, speaking of that previous video, I seen someone say that the Radeon GPU was faster because it was using more of the CPU. Well, that's because if the CPU is generating more frames, it's going to work harder than the side that isn't generating as many frames. That kind of makes sense. But anyway, we're going to journey onto 1440p now, and this is going to see us continue the journey to opening up the embassy. So 1440p, here we go. Now, most of the 1440p part of this video will be cinematics, and we're not going to watch all of it because it's about 8 minutes worth of it. So we're going to skip ahead a bit, but the results that I've taken, averages and 1% lows, are obviously at the end of this recording. And this sees the 6800 XT remain in the lead on the averages with 91 FPS versus 85 FPS for the 3080 Ti, which equals to a 7% lead for the 6800 XT. So you can see that gap closing up a little. And on the 1% lows, the 6800 XT still has a healthy lead of 15% with 69 FPS versus 60 FPS for the 3080 Ti. Now, one thing you can clearly see with the 3080 Ti, that now it can stretch its legs and go beyond 420 watts. So what that means is that at 1080p, even with the 7800X 3D, we appear to have been CPU bound, which, if you know about the NVIDIA driver overhead, is there's essentially a bit of a higher CPU cost for NVIDIA GPUs versus AMD ones. So what you will normally see is that if you present a CPU bound scenario for both Radeon and GeForce, you will normally see the Radeon GPUs be slightly ahead. Now, this is usually not a big deal if you have fast CPU, but if you had a slower CPU and a fast GPU, this could be more of like a highlighted feature. What I'm gonna do, and what I'm thinking of doing, actually, you guys can let me know below if you want to see this, but I'm thinking of doing a CPU comparison. I have some Ryzen CPUs, and I wanted to check out the Ryzen 2600, 3700X, 5900X, and my 7800X 3D as well, because this game is very well CPU optimized from what I've seen. Even when it's CPU bound, the frame rate is actually really good. Although we are going to examine a part where the frame rate falls apart on both GPUs actually, but that is coming up in a bit. But anyway, I am going to make that comparison because I just want to test it and see how the game would run on a 5-6-year-old CPU, right? I have a feeling it's going to do quite well actually. But anyway, for 1440p, both of these GPUs will deliver you I would say, an overall 90 FPS experience, which for me personally, for these type of games, these single player, high fidelity games, 90 FPS is actually a very good frame rate. For me personally, I will play these games at 90 FPS locks all day long. As a matter of fact, that's how I'm playing Dragon's Dogma 2 at the moment, is at a 90 FPS lock, and it's beautiful. Now, if you wanted to, you could turn on FSR and or DLSS, and you would be able to maintain 120 FPS, no problem. Just keep in mind that these cinematics can actually be a bit more demanding than actually playing the game. From what I've noticed, not a huge difference, but they tend to be a bit more demanding than actually playing the game, believe it or not.
Hey, Nozar, you stupid bastard. You think you got the authority to keep that door shut in the savior of Meridian's face? What do you think Sun King Avad is gonna do when he hears what you did? Promote you, huh? Let her through, boys. Saving the world.
Looks like Aaron's a little bit hammered, huff that brew. But anyway, let's take a look at 4K now, where things get a little bit interesting. In this short run here, both graphics cards actually perform pretty much identical. Not really any different. But we're going to enter quite a bit of a long cinematic here, which we're not going to watch the whole thing, but I will be pointing out some things that stood out to me, and that is basically the performance on both cards. I don't know if the game is loading something here, but this was quite a bit of a long cinematic that leads into a couple different fights actually, which we will examine separately. But just pay attention to the frame time graph, and it is a bit, there's quite a few hitches, and it seems like the game could be loading something. Now, this does not happen while you play, but I did compare the averages and 1% lows regardless. And this time we have the 3080 Ti ahead by only 4% on the averages with 50 FPS versus 6800 XT's 48 FPS, so only 2 FPS difference. And then on the 1% lows, the 6800 XT was ahead by 8%. So 26 FPS on the 1% lows to 3080 Ti's 24 FPS, so not very good. Obviously, these are not great frame rates. This is because of the way these cinematics are running, though. You will see at combat, they're much better, the frame rates. But at first I thought it was maybe a VRAM thing with the 3080 Ti. And then looking at the 6800 XT, you pretty much see the same exact thing. Although the 6800 XT does have slightly better 1% lows. So who knows? Maybe it is a slight factor in these cinematics. I don't know. But let's examine the combat actually, where there is gameplay at 4K native. There's 2 combat sections we're going to look at. So this sees the first time we're looking at combat at 4K native here, and our 1% lows are actually much better now than they were during that cinematic. So clearly the game was loading something. But if we examine the averages and 1% lows, this time we have the 3080 Ti ahead on averages and 1% lows, but it's not much at all. It's actually below 5%, so I'd consider this equal. But we have 56 FPS on the 3080 Ti versus 54 FPS on the 6800 XT, and 46 FPS for the 1% lows on the 3080 Ti compared to 45 FPS for the 1% lows on the 6800 XT. So clearly, you not going to be able to get a 4K 60 experience in this game with these GPUs, but that's okay because we could use DLSS and FSR, or we could tone down some of the graphical settings if you prefer the native resolution. It's up to you, but I would consider this even for both GPUs. They're both pretty much the same, while the 6800 XT consumes noticeably less power. Now this here is the second stage of the combat. We're still at 4K. We're going to check out FSR and DLSS next, but here we see essentially very similar performance. We have the 3080 Ti only 2% faster on the averages, 54 FPS versus 6800 XT's 53 FPS. And for the 1% lows, the 6800 XT is ahead this time by 7% at 45 FPS versus 3080 Ti's 42 FPS. So it's pretty much the same as previously. But anyway, what about DLSS and FSR though? Let's check it out. This here is the last boss battle of this event before we're able to open up the embassy, and we survive Regala's ambush with DLSS and FSR set to quality. We see the 6800 XT and 3080 Ti be equal as far as averages with 73 FPS. And for the 1% lows, the 6800 XT is 7% ahead with 62 FPS compared to 3080 Ti's 58 FPS. So we see both GPUs here be able to deliver a 60 FPS plus experience at 4K with FSR and DLSS set to quality. And I say plus because it is usually a bit above that, but our 1% lows are right at 60 FPS, which is kind of what you want to see, consistency. So this feels great. Now, to be fair, at 4K native, actually with VRR on a VRR display, it's not that bad, but obviously DLSS and FSR quality give you a more smooth and fluid experience, which is probably what I would go for if you had either GPU. Well, onto my conclusion then. I'm not really surprised at the results because I've seen this game does actually pretty good on Radeon GPUs. If you looked at my 7900 XTX and 4090 comparison, we've seen the Radeon GPU match the 4090 at much higher power consumption, but it was still interesting nonetheless. And with these two GPUs, I've done a ton of comparisons. The 3080 Ti is usually ahead by a bit, but sometimes they are equal. But to see it at 4K, it is kind of impressive how well the Radeon GPUs do here. So could this be because the game was designed for the PS5 running at RDNA 2 and the 6800 XT is RDNA 2 with double the compute units of the PS5? I don't know, but it's interesting nonetheless. But anyway, guys, give the video a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I'm out and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.